The course of every nation, from the dawn of human history, has been defined by a select few iconic moments, an exclusive band of inspiring events, and a decisive series of pivotal outcomes. But in the centuries of our country's existence, one fateful naval encounter has risen above the rest in influence. Its significance rivals the most famed and beloved scenes known by all Americans, from Washington crossing the Delaware to the raising of the Stars and Stripes over Mount Suribachi. This influential maritime clash is the Battle of Midway. In order to understand the impact of these early days of June 1942, one must understand the nation on each side. We begin with a dominant naval power in the Pacific, prior to the battle, Imperial Japan. Known for its brutality and loyalty to its emperor, Japan was a society brimming with nationalistic fervor. This Asian state had quickly industrialized in the mid-19th century upon the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry. After realizing the detrimental consequences of their traditionally isolationistic policies, the Japanese raced to become a modernized country as to be able to compete with the industrialized West. During this time, a deep sense of national identity began to take root. Much of this new identity was centered around military prowess. After instituting mandatory military service among all males in 1876, the Japanese celebrated a series of successful campaigns. For example, Japan was able to conquer the Chinese-controlled territory of Taiwan in 1895. In addition, the small Asian country delivered a humiliating defeat to the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. In the years leading up to the Second World War, the people and leaders of Japan took great pride and pleasure in the might of their military. Despite a defeat at the Battle of the Coral Sea, this confidence was certainly sported, and it had little reason to waver going into the summer of 1942, as the Japanese planned to clear their communication and supply lines to the West Indies. The U.S. controlled the Philippines, disrupting Japanese movements in and around the Southwest Pacific. This expansionistic Asian state, however, had a plan to change all of that. Opposite Imperial Japan was an enraged United States, seeking to defend its own national security, as well as exact its revenge in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, leading up to the Battle of Midway, the U.S. was not the undisputed global superpower that it is today. Following the horrendous cost of human life in the Great War, Americans were not in favor of becoming involved in yet another major conflict. In addition, the crash of the stock market in late October 1929 had plunged America, along with much of the modern world, into the Great Depression. During this time, as many as a third of Americans were unemployed. It was due to the devastated condition of the U.S. economy, as well as a perceived American reluctance to go to war, that Japan came to the conclusion that a decisive strike against U.S. naval power would force America into submission. The Japanese were greatly mistaken. After the attack, the United States, in essence, awakened. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stated, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." As the military swelled in size, American industry began its transition into a war economy, producing all necessary tools of combat. Moreover, the United States had won a strategic victory over the Japanese a month prior to the encounter Midway at the Battle of Coral Sea, giving the nation a morsel of confidence and momentum. However, despite growing industrial capacity and prior success, the United States was certainly the underdog of the Pacific as the Battle of Midway approached. This fateful battle, waged over a small island directly in the center of the world's largest ocean, was fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. After the Japanese radio code was broken by Lieutenant Commander Joseph J. Rochefort and his hypo team of cryptanalysts, the United States was made aware of Japan's intentions to target the island of Midway. To combat the incoming naval Japanese forces, U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz sent Task Force 16, including carriers Hornet and Enterprise, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, as well as Task Force 17, including the Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The outnumbered American naval force, along with sailors and Army and Marine pilots stationed at Midway, went toe-to-toe with Japanese Vice Admiral Nagumo and his strike force designated Kido Butai. Utilizing intelligence gathered from the intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, the Americans were able to take their foe by surprise. Although initial aerial attacks proved fruitless against the Japanese, later attempts, led by pilots including Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, were successful in essentially devastating the opposing naval force. Task Forces 16 and 17 also had to endure Japanese counterattacks as the battle raged on. When the proverbial dust had settled over the Pacific, the United States emerged victorious. In total, Imperial Japan lost 292 aircraft, 4 carriers, and 1 cruiser, as well as suffering 2,500 casualties. On the other side, the United States lost 145 aircraft, 1 carrier, and 1 cruiser, all in addition to 307 casualties. In these few days of intense fighting, the tides of history changed course. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific for the Japanese. Prior to the battle, Imperial Japan had enjoyed significant territorial expansion with hardly any formidable resistance. However, the defeat of Vice Admiral Nagumo's strike force marked the end of Japan's brief age of imperialism. Never again would Japan exercise naval dominance over the Pacific Ocean, nor would it freely occupy any additional foreign territory. The great strides of military success and colonization, which had filled the previous 3 decades, quickly turned into a grand backward stumble as the Japanese Empire was dismantled. The most central shortcoming of the Japanese following the Battle of Midway was their inability to recuperate and rebuild. Heavily reliant upon resources from colonies, as well as military might to protect these resources, Japan was never able to fully reorganize as substantial a force once the balance of power shifted toward the United States. After successfully thwarting Japanese intentions to advance on Midway, the United States Navy was set on an irreversible path to prominence and responsibility. Following World War I, the U.S. was, for the first time, established as a true global power. However, the Seven Seas were not undoubtedly under its control and protection. This was certainly the case off the east coast of Asia. The United States and its Navy were in no position to exercise any type of authority over the Western Pacific. Imperial Japan's naval forces reigned supreme over the region. However, the naval standing of the United States was forever changed by the Battle of Midway. After defeating the commanding maritime force in the area, the U.S. Navy rose to a position of significant distinction and prestige as it went on the offensive. By the time the Japanese surrendered in September 1945, American industry was at maximum capacity and capability. Not only that, but the United States had played a key part in both the European and Pacific campaigns. This resulted in a distinguished role as a global superpower and leader. As the nation as a whole assumed this new responsibility, the United States Navy was not exempt. The nautical might of America's Navy stretched to encompass the 4 corners of the globe and all waters in between. In the decades following the Battle of Midway and the Second World War, America has become the most dominant naval force ever before seen by man. However, every time the power and presence of American naval forces abroad are witnessed, understand that this is not our right. It has not simply been granted to us in return for our existence as a nation. The supremacy of the United States Navy has been earned. It has been defended. It has been protected. And it has been ensured by the sacrifices made by humble patriots. In the fast-paced world of the present time, the root of this influence must not be forgotten. The Battle of Midway and the men who made claim to victory forever turned the tides of history. The course of a nation, the path of a people, was eternally altered. The weight and value of this event must never be underestimated, and the men who made it possible must never be forgotten.